Today in part one, I want to confront the myth that the Bible is untrustworthy as a historical document and therefore should be, according to our culture, easily dismissed. I'm going to give you 6 reasons today as to why I think we should rethink the Bible. Number one, when it comes to pushbacks, there's a number of major pushbacks in our culture. Perhaps you've experienced these in work, around the lunch table, in the canteen, school, online, or maybe you're here today and these are some of your pushbacks. Most people say the reason why I can't accept or embrace the Bible is because, number one, I doubt its authorship. I'm not really sure who wrote it. I'm not sure if they had credentials. I'm not sure they can be trusted. Number two, therefore, I doubt the accuracy of what was written, when it was written, how it was written, why it was written, and therefore, then, I can't accept it as being authentic. So most people's pushbacks in our culture are around these 3 things: the authorship, the accuracy, and the authenticity. Modern questions include, for example, is the Bible historically legitimate? Hasn't the Bible changed throughout history? Isn't the Bible full of contradictions? Aren't there stories that are added to the Bible later? Wasn't the Bible written by people who wanted power? That's a very good one right now in our culture. And doesn't the Bible have loads of outdated moral teachings on sexuality, identity, and ethics? And so most people say, well, I can't really embrace the Bible because historically speaking, the Bible has no value. Now, what's interesting is when you do your research on this, that may be what's true at a popular level. But when you look at what's been written academically, especially from the perspective of historians, it's like Mark Clark said in his book, The Problem of God. He said, but historians tell us that the Bible is actually one of the most, if not the most, reliable and credible documents from antiquity, meaning history. One of the reasons it has such a credibility as an ancient document is that it has remained largely the same throughout history. So when we think about the Bible, we think, I'm not really sure about the historical authorship, the historical accuracy, and therefore the historical authenticity. What we find is that may be true, that perspective, that worldview, that paradigm at a popular level, but when you get into academically, no one of any kind of serious scientific credibility is approaching the Bible like the popular level does. Actually, it is one of the most worthy documents of antiquity. Now, number 2, one of the things people say is, well, but isn't it full of contradictions? There's all these contradictions where it says this in one place and another thing in another place, and they don't align. And one of the most famous examples of this is found with the parable of the talents, Matthew 25, Luke 19. These two references tell the same parable, the parable of talents. In Matthew's gospel, we're told that a wealthy businessman goes away on a trip and gives his employees money and says, put the money to work. In fact, they're bags of gold. Whereas in Luke's gospel, we're told the man is actually going to go away to be coronated king and leaves his governors in charge and promises, if you put my money to work, I will give you cities. Now, if you're reading this, you're going, what's going on? It seems like these are contradictions. In one instance, it's money. In the other instance, it's cities. And again, truth be told, when I first started reading the Bible, I came across what I thought were contradictions. I freaked out a bit and thought, whoa, what's going on? Now, the truth is, it's actually very easily explained. Because think about this. What are the Gospels? There's 4 Gospels. Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, and Gospel of John. 2 of the 4 Gospels were written by people who were eyewitnesses. Matthew and John were part of Jesus' original 12 disciples. They wrote down and recorded what they saw as they saw it, right? But Mark and Luke were not written by eyewitness accounts. In fact, Luke, believe it or not, was actually a paid historian. Can you imagine in the first century what it must have been like when this crazy new faith was birthed in the city of Jerusalem and everyone was talking about having experienced a resurrected Christ and are so convinced, not by what they were taught, but by what they saw, that they're willing to give up their lives for this message. And it's like the best attempts of the religious order of the day, the Pharisees and Judaism, despite the best attempts of the Roman Empire to quell and to quench and to crush this movement, it made its way all the way to Rome. And we're told in the city of Rome, within 10, 15, 20 years, slaves are being saved and governors are being saved and centurions are being saved, that God was working, building his kingdom in every strata amongst every ethnicity and nationality. And so this very wealthy Roman citizen called Theophilus says, I want to fact check this. How has this thing gotten here and what's driving it. So he paid Luke to go back to first century Palestine and to interview eyewitnesses and put together an account. So Luke writes the gospel. Luke writes the book of Acts, tells the story of the growth of the church. Now Mark's gospel, historians tell us, is actually he didn't meet Jesus, but we're told that he penned the eyewitness account of Peter. So Matthew, Mark, and John are all either directly written accounts of people who were there with Jesus, and Luke was a historical fact check that happened after. What's the point? The point is, what they're recording in their Gospels is a time frame that lasted about 3.5 years. Jesus' earthly ministry lasted for 3.5 years. And we can imagine, for example, that Jesus would have told the parable of the talents many times, in many places, many different ways over the years. It was not uncommon for Jesus to tell the same parables. The difference is, depending on his context and depending on the metaphors, he might alternate the emphasis according to the context. You go, well, that sounds a bit, flaky. No, we do this today. We do it all the time. We understand, even by modern day standards, that when you're trying to tell a metaphor, it isn't the exact detail that's important, it's the gist. What is the gist of the story? What is the gist of Jack and Jill? What is the gist of Red, what's her name? Right, thank you. You can tell I'm fifth generation all boys. I can't even say the name of the book properly. Like, what is the gist? It's like sometimes your granny may be a wolf. That's the end of the story, right? If you don't feed her, she might eat you. I forget. The point is there's a gist. So whether or not the story is told the same way all the time or not isn't really important. In this instance, what is important is that the message and the point are consistent. And what we see is, in the Gospels, is certain things like events are factual. The resurrection is an event. It factually happened, and all authors say the same thing. But when it comes to Jesus' teaching, especially his use of metaphors, which are symbolic, they may change. And again, this isn't abnormal to us. In fact, I remember years ago, a friend of mine who was in college, he was studying what we call homiletics, which is the art or science or discipline of preaching. And he was talking to his professor about something like this, where he was struggling with attention and text. And the professor said, well, didn't you give me a few of your messages to listen to and give you feedback on? And he said, yeah. And he said, well, I noticed in this one, you said this and this a certain way. But then in another one, you said that and that a certain way and didn't say this and this. He goes, well, it's the same story, but when I was speaking here, I was speaking to adults. And I was speaking here, I was speaking to teenagers. So I adjusted my approach based on the context. But is the story still true? That's the question. Is the story still consistent? Absolutely, it's the same story. So the point is, even though one may say cities and gold, other says money, the point is the same. God holds accountable when it comes to our stewardship of what he's given us. So the story, the point, the principle is consistent. This is why it was Josh McDowell, world-renowned apologist, said that the Gospels in particular are the best or most renowned documents in antiquity, meaning when it comes to the New Testament in particular, like nobody wants the New Testament to be true. Nobody benefits in terms of antagonistically with the Gospels being accurate. Like from the day that Jesus rose from the dead to this day, culture as a whole has been trying to disprove, discredit, and diss the gospel message. Yet because there's so much attestation, because there's so much scrutiny, because everybody's trying to prove it wrong and it keeps being proven right, it makes this text one of the most trustworthy texts in antiquity, which is amazing. In fact, bottom line, one more thought on this. When it comes to actual disputed passages in the Bible, there are no more than four actually disputed passages in the Bible, of which are 2 verses or more in length. And in each and every case, the story or the point does not change. So when it comes to contradictions, there aren't any, because we understand that sometimes metaphors change based on the audience and context, but the point was the same. Number 3, another major pushback against the Bible is, well, the Bible made a mistake. What mistake, you ask? Well, archaeologically speaking, because the Bible is so consistent in naming places and naming people and geographically, geolocating things, that when archaeologists went to those places looking for evidence, they couldn't find it. Therefore, the Bible is wrong. A classic example of this is found in John's Gospel, chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. We're told that Jesus one day came into the city of Jerusalem. He came in by the sheep gate. Why is that important? Because every gateway into the city had a name. And that perfectly and accurately geolocates which way Jesus came into the city. Just like if I said to you, I came into the city via the M3. We all know where that is. If you don't know where that is, well then, God help you. So the problem was in the 1800s, these archaeologists went to the sheep gate in Jerusalem and started looking for what happened next to the story. Well, verse 2, we're told that there was this pool area, the kind of colonnades of Solomon's colonnades. There was these pools where people would go if they were sick. There was this beautiful, area with colonnades and arches, and it was wonderful. And we're told that in that place at the time, by the sheep gate, Jesus did a miracle. And so these enlightened, skeptical archaeologists wanted to figure out, well, is there any validity in the archaeological testimony of the text, John's Gospel? So they went there and dug and didn't find anything. Came back, wrote all these scientific journals, lectured and taught the world, you can't trust the Bible because archaeologically the Bible is full of nonsense. It's made up, misguided, mumbo jumbo. And for about 80 years, that's what people believed about this text. However, at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, some more architects with better equipment went back to the same place, went back to the sheep gate in Jerusalem to redig the same site. And guess what? They found the pools and they found the colonnades, thus proving that John actually was accurate in time stamping and geolocating the event. Now, that doesn't mean we should necessarily trust the miracle, but what it does say is the Bible is consistent in its archaeological references. In fact, the other day I bumped into a guy at a conference and he is a tour guide in Saudi Arabia. Crazy, right? And he's based in the western part of Arabia. And because tourism now is opening up there and people are allowed from the west to go in, people of other faiths allowed to go visit, one of the things they discovered was for years, archaeologists disputed where was the location of Mount Sinai. You're thinking, what's Mount Sinai? Well, Mount Sinai is one of the most famous mountains in scriptures. It's one of the key places God did a lot of things. And so for years, they're trying to figure out where it was. And some thought it was in Jordan. Some thought it was in Egypt. Well, actually, it's in Saudi Arabia. It was there all the time. But because we couldn't get access, we didn't know that. So the point is, as the world changes, as science changes, so does the opportunity to discover new things. The bottom line, however, according to Nelson Glueck, who's one of the most well-respected archaeologists in the world, he said, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever contradicted a biblical reference. Categorically, no archaeological discovery has ever contradicted a biblical reference. How cool is that? Another big pushback culturally is, well, what about this tension of the Old Testament versus the New Testament? It seems to me, Jamie, like when I read the Old Testament, God get out of bed, stepped on some Lego, spilled his coffee himself. I was just angry all the time. Fire and plagues and anger. And then it's like God went to a counselor and rediscovered himself and is so loving and kind. Like, what's going on? Is God a celestial schizophrenic? Like, explain to me the tension of the Old and New Testament. Again, it's a good question. And the answer is, we have to remember that when we approach the scripture old and new, that it isn't old and new. It's old into new. It isn't like two separate, distinct things. It's one story, one consistent story of God's desire to redeem mankind from sin and to reunite mankind with him in relationship. We cannot comprehend, therefore, the meta-narrative of the big picture of Scripture if we don't see it as an unfolding story. For example, we know this. You know this how? Because think about the difference of a photograph and a video. If I show you a photograph, it's still, it's static, it's a moment in time. And we can try guess, and we can we can speculate what's going on with the photograph. But unless we have footage, we can't really say for certain what happened next. Too many people approach the old and new like two photographs that are static and unchanging. But in actual fact, the story of Scripture is more like a movie. Let me give you another example. How many remember the famous movie Avengers Endgame? Anybody? There's that really, key moment where Thanos snaps his fingers and half everyone who lives in the universe disappears, right? And then this scene happens next. He's in this quantum space. He's reunited with the ghost of his daughter who he killed. And that's it. If I told you today, that's how the story ends, right? Everyone's gone. bad ending, so on and so forth. You go, no, that's not how it ends. I go, I have photographic evidence. This is how the movie ends. You go, no, it's not, because if you press play on this scene, you will see that the Avengers come back and Iron Man dies, which still is a tragedy to this day. So I think it was a bad move on Marvel's behalf. Iron Man should never die. And so on. Why? Because you've seen the movie. Because you've seen the movie, you understand the story. It's why Mark Clark says the Bible is a progressive revelation that is not static, but reveals the truth about God to us in stages, the latter stages of which overshadow and leave behind the former. In other words, what he's saying is not that the Old Testament is unimportant or has no value, but the New Testament is the fulfillment. It is the end game of God. The whole thing from the beginning was always pointing to the person of Jesus. From the minute God created Adam and Eve to the day John saw a vision of heaven, the story is the same one. A story of God's love for mankind and his desire to redeem us to himself in relationship. Therefore, Mark Clark concludes, it isn't a contradiction, but a maturation. Not a contradiction, but a maturation of a story. Another major pushback, here's a good word, is when it comes to the historicity of the Bible. Say with me, 1, 2, 3. Historicity. You sound so sophisticated, don't you? You can say, historicity. What does historicity mean? Historicity means historic validity or historic authenticity. When it comes to the historic authenticity of the Bible, how does the Bible fare? How does the Bible do when compared to other ancient texts that we believe are credible and that we accept as not only fact, but we accept as truth? Let me give you 4 case studies. Here's the first one. This is my good friend Thucydides. You all know Thucydides? Say with me, 1, 2, 3, Thucydides. I mean, God bless that man. His mother clearly didn't love him, give him like that. But Thucydides, he lived in the year 460 to 365 BC. The reason why Thucydides is important is because nearly everything we know and accept as fact, as truth, about Greco-Roman culture, Greek-Roman culture, comes from his writings. He has shaped, more than anyone else, our understanding of Greek-Roman culture. And what we see in plays and movies and art and all these things are massively shaped by this one person. Now, when it comes to his writings, how many copies of his works do we have? And the answer is we have 8 copies of what Thucydides first wrote. The gap between the event and the nearest manuscript is 1,300 years. Meaning from his last copy to our first copy, there's a gap of 1,300 years. Yet we believe and are told it's historically accurate, factual, and therefore true. Another example, you have heard this guy. His name is Aristotle, right? Come on. Aristotle, 384, 322 BC, perhaps the greatest living philosopher in all of Western civilization. We're told that we have 5 copies of his poetic works, and the gap between his last work and our first copy is 1,400 years. And yet we're told it's true and trustworthy. Here's what you know again. What about my man Julius Caesar, everybody? Come on. Just decided one day I'm going to take over the whole world. The founder of the Roman Empire. He lived from 100 to 44 BC. There are several copies of his works. The gap is 1,000 years. And to make things even more interesting, all the copies we have are of his account of his life. If you had a chance to write a story to leave behind and nobody could ever dispute it, what would you write about yourself? And if you were a potential megalomaniac, narcissistic dictator who dreamed of taking over the whole world, well then how much trust would you put in a book that he wrote about himself? And the answer is very little. But yet we're told in our textbooks in primary school, secondary school, university, that a lot of what we believe and teach as truth comes from a copy of a book that he wrote about himself 1,000 years after the event. And our culture's fine. Yeah, that's fine. That's truth. What about my man Alexander the Great, a.k.a. Colin Farrell? Colin Farrell was born in 356 BC and died in 323 BC. He is the leader of the great Greek Empire. He is the reason why Hellenistic or Greek culture basically grew all over the world. In fact, so impactful was his reign that when the Romans 300, 400 years later invaded the world, they kept the Greek language as the main language of the world. That's why the New Testament is written in Greek, because it was so powerful. Alexander was an amazing leader. He was the founder of the Greek Empire. We have 2 copies of his work, which he also wrote about himself, by the way. And the gap between the first copy and our earliest manuscript is 400 500 years. And again, when it comes to Alexander, like Julius, like Aristotle, like Thucydides, these are all taught as fact and therefore true. Now the question is, where does the New Testament stand? How does the New Testament fare in this kind of historical category of great documents? Well, we know the New Testament was written between 50 and 90 AD. Watch this. There aren't 8 copies. There aren't 5 copies. There aren't several copies. And certainly aren't 2 copies. There are over 25,000 copies and fragments of the New Testament in our possession. Well, what's the gap, Jamie? Is it 1,300 years, 400 years, 1,000 years, 400 years? It's like 70 years. The gap is 70 years from the first copy to the first message that we have in our possession. In fact, we know that the first New Testament book was written 15 years after the resurrection of Jesus. It's huge. Because our culture goes, yep, no problem, yep, no problem, yep, no problem, yep, no problem. Can't accept the New Testament. I mean, it's all made up, right? Are you kidding me? It is the most impressive, most robust, most historically accurate document in all of antiquity. And it deserves more respect than we give it as a culture. But again, many historians talk about, well, the problem is, like I said, between the first copy and the event, and our first copy. The event versus the document. Like I said, the New Testament was written 15 years after the life of Jesus. Why is that important? Well, it's very important because if you're going to make up a lie, if you're going to make up a world religious-sized lie, then you better make sure that no one who lived during the real events is there. Because all I have to do is go, you're wrong. I was there. He wasn't raised. He didn't do that miracle. Like there's people out there who, again, don't want you to succeed as Christians and who are against you. So why would you write something in the lifetime of people who are witnesses? And plus the fact, people say, oh, well, the gospel's only made up because people want to be famous and get power. Listen to me. Every single one of Jesus' first followers were brutally murdered. Families killed. Property confiscated. Tortured. Destroyed. And not just destroyed in a sense, but actually at the entertainment of people. They were fed to lions and bears and sodden too and crucified and run over by horses and stabbed. What gain could there possibly have been for the first followers of Jesus to start this thing? I mean, what kind of madman we understand, but having hundreds and thousands of believers all paying the price with their life. Why? Not because of something they were taught, because of someone they saw. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, after that he appeared, this is Jesus, to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. Meaning Jesus' resurrection wasn't just like Peter saw him and told everyone, I saw Jesus, believe me. It wasn't like 3 people manifested or imagined or were smoking magic mushrooms and saw Jesus and made up this thing. It's like over 500 people witnessed the resurrected Christ at one time. And then Paul says, because it only happens 15, 20 years after the event, they're all still alive. Well, most of them are. So if you want to go back and talk to them, you can go back and chat to them. Like I said, the Bible has time-stamped, named, and geolocated these towns, villages, cities, that this time, if someone didn't believe, they could go back and simply ask someone. It's why the famous scholar and theologian F.F. Bruce says, it can't have been so easy, as some writers seem to think, to invent words and deeds, to invent their words and deeds of Jesus in those early years. When so many of his disciples were about who could remember what had and had not happened, there were also plenty of people at the same time opposed to Christianity, and therefore the disciples could not afford to risk inaccuracies. Again, the New Testament wasn't written in a time where everyone's like, oh, this is great, tell us more. Culture like now was not open to, did not welcome, did not want the truth of the gospel to propagate. So the danger was that they were making up false information. Anyone, anytime, could simply fact check and discredit the message. Yet, we're told that despite all the best efforts of the culture at the time, or be the Romans or the Jews, still the word stands today. And what's also interesting is, again, if you're if you're interested in starting a world religion, definitely don't involve multiple people. Just have you one revelation, you see it all, you're the man, you're God's special person. Like, don't have multiple people, because it's very hard, isn't it, to create something using multiple people. And certainly don't write yourself into the story as a loser, right? I mean, think about it. If you're going to start a world religion, don't tell a story of a poor carpenter boy born of a virgin in a manger who has never built something or wrote something or really did anything other than teach people that he is the way, the truth, and life, and certainly don't have your God that you're supposed to represent die horrendously, horrifically, and humiliatingly on a cross. It's not the kind of religion that inspires faith in people, let's be honest. And then if you're one of the authors, certainly don't tell stories like, yeah, I was Peter and I was leader and I denied even knowing him 3 times. Yeah, I was Thomas and I was there. I saw the fish and loaves. I saw the blind man, but I even doubted. Like, don't write yourself in as a loser. Who wants to follow that kind of religion? Which the questions we asked. Why did the authors of the New Testament write themselves in the way they did? Well, the logical conclusion can only be because that's what happened. That's the truth. They were imperfect, broken people, lost, hurting, confused, and they came to embrace the Christian message not because of something they were taught. Because when you experience, like I did, a resurrected Jesus, and he changes your life forever, there are things that are more important than death and life itself, like eternity. And they gave their lives in their day so that we in our day could have this word. Plus the fact is also, remember, it's important, that the world, historically speaking, has always been a small place. Our world right now is not small. I mean, social media, Wikipedia, internet, and so on. We're just so connected, and information is so readily accessible, which is not a bad thing. I think it's amazing, personally, that despite all the advances of the microscope, and all the advances of the telescope, and all the advances of the internet, still science cannot disprove the message of Jesus. But back in the old days, our world was small. And in the small world, things didn't change that much. So you could go back and ask people and they would tell you this is how it was. I remember a few years ago, I was in a little village in a place called Cajaíba, Bahia, Brazil. We brought a team from our church there to go help the church in Brazil. And I had to get this boat there. So I landed at the dock, got on the boat. It was very sketchy. The guy's like, listen, there's fog. We can't see what's out there. We might hit something and sink. So if we do, grab your luggage and don't let go. And also be careful because there's all sorts of wildlife, like alligator stuff in the water. So, best of luck. I was like, this is great. And so we get to the little village and I get off the boat and I'm walking up the ramp and there's these 2 old guys sitting there smoking cigarettes. I'm like, man, what are the chances these 2 guys know who I'm looking for? So I said, hey, by any chance, do you guys know Pastor Eric? Oh yeah, we know him. I'm like, how the heck have I come halfway across the world to a village in the north and they know him? Because the world was small. And it's very hard to invent stories that aren't true when the world is small. Because everyone remembers. And still, despite the world being small, despite political, religious, and spiritual oppression, the word came true and the word has come to us. Why? Sir Frederick G. Kennan, who was a former director of the British Museum, said, in no other case is the interval of time between the composition of the book and the date of the earliest extant manuscript so short as in the New Testament. How incredible is that? Okay, one more. Number 6. What about morality? So we talked about, pushbacks, talked about, historicity, talked about all these. What about morality? Like when it comes to the questions of slavery and polygamy and misogyny, like how do you justify that? Like I read the Bible and God isn't just like, God's people have slaves. And some of the most famous leaders have many wives, and some of the greatest people in the West are total misogynists. Like, how do you explain this? And it's true, these are hard things. And again, I submit to you that it would have been so much easier if this was a manufactured story to leave those things out than to put them in. But they're there. Why? Because that's what happened. And we got to be careful that we don't read our cultural moment into an ancient world where these things, although definitely not good, were still normative. It was normal for most of human history to have these things existing in society. For example, maybe one day, 1,000 years from now, our culture will look back at our moment and they'll ask the question, was it wise to give children unfettered access to the internet through mobile devices? We don't know if it's good or bad because we're living in it. We are a social experiment. We know that definitely the sociology and psychology and all the ologies of our children are being transformed because of technology. We just don't know if it's good or bad yet. One day in the future, a culture will look back at our culture and by their cultural norms, they will judge us. That's okay. That's part of history. But what's normal to us may not be acceptable later. So we have to be careful that there's no such thing as total objectivity. We can't be so selfishly altruistic to think we know all and we're the best culture ever lived. We have so many of our own problems in our own society. But we do have to recognize, though, is that although the Bible explains what's happening in these stories, we should not equate the Bible's explanation with the Bible's affirmation. Just because the Bible mentions or says, here's what happens, doesn't necessarily mean the Bible is affirming what should happen. And in fact, you may say, well, there's no outright, command in the Old Testament to call out these things. And it's true. Because if you were to, even as recent as 300-400 years ago, if you were to stand up in any culture in the world and say, slavery's wrong, everybody would laugh at you. And everybody would think you're crazy. Because it's been the norm of history for so long. Yet what the Bible does do very subversively and very interestingly, what it does do is it does kind of show us that when you engage in these kind of things, it doesn't tend to work out well for them, and it doesn't tend to work out well for you. For example, one of the most famous characters in the Old Testament is King David. And King David potentially was a misogynist. I mean, he saw a woman and said, I want her. So to get her, he killed her husband and kind of made her come to the palace and slept with her and had a baby. He did that, which is crazy and so tragic. And even though the Bible doesn't say what he did was wrong, actually it does in this instance because a prophet came and said that was wrong. But even if it didn't, the point is, what does the Bible show us? The cost of this act actually cost him his kids, his legacy, his family, and the kingdom. The kingdom was divided because of his poor moral choice. Not only that, but actually so many of the amazing leaders that God called, like Moses, like Joseph, like Daniel, were all people in slavery. Which, think for a second, for most of human history, what the Bible is saying, it doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, slave, or free, God can use you. God has a plan and purpose for your life. And even though things aren't ideal, if you're obedient and if you answer, he will take your life and use it to bring the kingdom of God to the world. So again, there's so much more in this, and we could do a whole series on it, maybe we will. But the point is, the Bible does not shy away from hard things, neither should we. But we have to be careful not to be culturally arrogant and think that our world is the best world. And just because the Bible explains a thing doesn't mean it's necessarily affirming a thing. And oftentimes what we're told is that the consequence of our sin is that we hurt others, and in doing so, we hurt ourselves. So, in conclusion then, because there's a lot there, what are we saying? What are we saying in conclusion? In conclusion, what I'm saying is simply this. The Bible is a historically trustworthy document. It is worthy of our trust. Now again, maybe you're here, you're not a Jesus follower, you're a skeptic, you don't believe in God, don't believe in Christianity. That's okay. It may not be worthy of your admiration. Maybe you're not sitting here going, oh, that's amazing, Jamie, great word, well done. It may fall short of your admiration, but it beckons your consideration. Surely you can't dismiss all that I've said and say, well, I don't believe it. It's factual. As a historical document, there's nothing like this book. And by all means, you should reject it if you don't believe in it, if you don't agree with it, if you don't want it. But you can't dismiss it as some made-up fable, fairy tale thing, because that is just not the case. It is the most robust, most intense, most impressive, most contested, most attested, most consistent, most eternal text in all of human history. But still, that's not the reason why we believe. Our belief is not founded on the historical accuracy of a book, or more specifically a library, because the Bible is a manuscript of manuscripts, 66 books, 3 languages, 50 plus authors, one consistent message. It isn't the book that saves us. It's the person about whom the book is written. It's the purpose of the book. And it's worthy of our trust, it's worthy of our consideration when it comes to questions of our relationships, when it comes to questions of our sexuality, when it comes to questions of morality and identity and eternity. The Bible beckons our consideration. It is a manuscript for sure, but more than that, it carries a message. And that message reveals the man, and his name is Jesus. And he is the only hope for humanity. He is the only hope we have in our world. And it's good for us to know all this interesting fact about the manuscript and its literary and historical pedigree. But ultimately, that's not what we believe. That's not why we believe. We believe because Jesus came into the world and gave his life so that we who are lost and far from God and broken can be redeemed and reconciled and restored. And we can serve God with our life and our generation. When I first was given a Bible, it was my wife who gave me a Bible all those years ago. And she wrote in the front cover a verse. And the verse comes from John's Gospel, chapter 8 and verse 32. It says, "You shall know the truth." What's the purpose of the Bible? The purpose of the Bible is that we would know the truth. We live in a culture, a postmodern culture where truth is subjective. Everyone's truth is valid. Everyone's truth can coexist. Nonsense. If something is true, it's true. And if something's true and something else is true and it contradicts the truth, only one thing can be true. Truth is truth. And we're told in the Bible that the purpose of God's word is that we would know the truth. And the truth isn't a philosophy. It isn't a principle. It isn't a religious way of life. It isn't a denomination. Long after Lighthouse Church is gone, long after all the different denominations have all gone, the truth will stand forever. Because the truth is a person. And his name is Jesus. And the promise of this word is when through this word you know the truth shall set you free. That's the purpose of this book. From day one, God has wanted humanity to live in freedom with him. Life is not something that belongs to those who don't love God. Life and life in its fullest comes only to those who love and serve and walk with God. And the promise is if we submit our lives, if we open our hearts to this truth, we shall be set free. And this actually is, in my opinion, what the world needs right now. The world needs freedom, emotional freedom, spiritual freedom, all sorts of freedoms. So as we close and pray, I want to ask two questions. If you're here and you're a Jesus follower, you're a Christian, someone who says, I believe in God, I believe in the Bible, then my question to you is, where are you in relation to this promise? Because maybe you know the truth, but has the truth fully set you free? Are there parts of your life right now where you know, you're like, oh God, you can have my Sunday morning. And oh God, you can have my Spotify playlist. I know God, you can have, but don't ask me my sexuality. Don't ask me to see what I'm doing in my DMs and Instagram. Don't ask me about how I'm spending my money. Don't go there, God. Because I want to be free a little bit, but not completely free. There's no half measures. Either Jesus is Lord of all, or he isn't Lord at all. If you're a Jesus follower, I'm asking you, where are you in relation to this promise? Because God wants you to be completely free. Totally free. Free. And through your life and through the testimony of your freedom, that other people, even though we're broken, ordinary people, we would see in us the freedom of God and go, hey, I want that too. So where are you in regards to the truth that sets you free? And second of all, if you're here and you're like I was for so long, not a Jesus follower, not interested, not even open, aggressive, antagonistic, angry with God, then let me ask you this. What could God do? If God exists, just go with me for a second. If God were real, what could God do if for a moment you opened your heart to the truth? Like, would it be worth the risk? Like, if all this is baloney, and I'm talking complete nonsense, then what's the worst that can happen? Nothing. And you're right and I'm wrong, ha ha ha. But if what this verse says is true about truth, and you open your heart today, and God fills your heart with love and peace and kindness and grace and mercy and hope, and your life is completely transformed, would even the possibility of that type of salvation merit you taking a risk? I believe it does. I want to invite you today, as the band come in a moment, lead us in a response song. Why not open your heart and say, Jesus, I don't even know if you're real. I don't even know why I'm even praying. But I ask you, if you're real, I want to know the truth. And I want to be set free. My guess is that when you pray that prayer, God's going to blow your mind and change your life. Either way, we can trust the word. Because the word is true. Not just a document, but as a living word that lives in our hearts, the word is true. And we want, as a church, to lead people into freedom. How we do that is through the truth. So